you have any questions, we ask that you use the chat room to put questions and participate. It's your event. You all have asked for it, and we're back, and we just want to share. And so on behalf of the School of Social Work, we welcome you today to Noontime Knowledge on Domestic Violence Awareness. And so I would like to turn it over to Lindsay Johnson, who will introduce our moderators. And before we get started, we ask that everyone please mute your mic unless you have a question, and then you can unmute it. But for the sake of the program, we ask that you please mute your mic. Thank you. Lindsay Johnson.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today. It is Dr. Adresa Snyder. She is an artist, educator, scholar for the Jefferson County Project Manager and Liaison for Alabama Appleseed. She
y'all got y'all want us to buy them and we put them
Can you please mute yourself?
You can buy them bags and then give.
Thank you. I'm sorry. She is committed to educating and inspiring others to excellence. Her academic interests lie in the areas of rhetorical criticism and Black feminist studies. Moreover, she is attentive to studying modes of empowerment through acts of self-defining and other forms of resistance to controlling images or pejorative stereotypes. As the Jefferson County Project Manager and Liaison for Alabama Appleseed, Snyder coordinates the Jefferson County Equitable Fines and Fees Initiative, known as Project JEF. Project JEF is a groundbreaking and innovative research development. It is the first of its kind in the state of focus on eradicating the criminalization of poverty through excessive fees and fines. Before going into public policy and advocacy work, Snyder was former visiting assistant professor of communication at Stanford University and once enjoyed a career in media. She worked with companies such as Animal Planet and Local 2 KPRC NBC affiliate in Houston, Texas. She is a writer at heart and frequently manuscripts an opinion column for the Birmingham Times. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Snyder for our moderator today.
Thank you, Lindsay, so much for that warm welcome. I really appreciate it. I looked up some stats today, and according to the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, also known as the NCDAV, in the state of Alabama, nearly 40% of the women experience intimate partner violence, and nearly 30% of men experience this. On average, nearly 20 people per minute in the United States are physically abused by an intimate partner. So we know that this conversation is very timely, and we know that this conversation is very needed. So before we get into the questions, I would like to introduce our esteemed panelists. I know that these women are very passionate about social work and making sure that we can provide help and assistance and aid to those who need us in the community. I'd like to start by introducing Dr. Catherine Carson. She's an assistant professor at the University of Alabama School of Social Work. Her research focuses on the intersection of violence and mental health, primarily in international settings. She has practice experience as the Gender-Based Violence Prevention and Response Coordinator for the American Refugee Committee in Thailand and has worked for various other non-government and UN organizations on issues of global violence prevention and response. Dr. Carson led the evaluation of SASA, a community mobilization approach to prevent domestic violence against women by changing social norms around gender and power across 6 countries in Africa. Again, that's 6 countries in Africa. Recently, her scholarly work has focused on the co-occurrence of intimate partner violence and child maltreatment in families, as well as research on best ways to support survivors of human trafficking. She teaches courses on program evaluation and international social work. Let's welcome Dr. Carson to our conversation today. Next, we have Jessica Hoggle. She is a licensed independent clinical social worker. She received her bachelor's degree in psychology from the University of Alabama at Birmingham and her master's degree in social work from the University of Alabama. She currently works as a therapist at the University of Alabama's Women and Gender Resource Center, where she has served for over 5 years working with students, faculty, and staff who are survivors of any form of interpersonal violence, including domestic violence, sexual assault, harassment, stalking, and childhood abuse. In her current role, she provides individual and group therapy services and also supervises MSW interns with an interest in IPV. She also has years of experience in the areas of victim advocacy, sexual assault counseling, and community health. She is currently in her final year of obtaining her DSW, congratulations, and her capstone project focuses on utilizing polyvagal informed therapeutic drumming and rhythm activities with victims of IPV as a creative modality to connect the mind and body in healing from trauma. Her personal interests include traveling, painting, and chasing her 3-year-old son. Let's welcome Jessica Hoggle. And certainly, last but not least, we would like to welcome Ella DeLuise Stewart to our talk. In 2020, she became a graduate of the University of Alabama, where she received her BSW in social work, and of Shelton State Community College, where she received a degree in associate in applied sciences. She is currently employed with the Housing Authority of the City of Northport of 21 years and holds a position of the Assistant Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program Manager and the Domestic Violence Coordinator. A wife to Christopher Stewart, 6 children, 8 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren, she is an inspiration to all that she encounters. A survivor of domestic violence herself, Stewart has been an advocate for the education and increased awareness of domestic violence. She has been a supporter of Turning Point for 20 plus years and has conducted workshops for both the Northport Police and Tuscaloosa departments. Her voice is much greater now, and she proudly serves as board member of the agency that helped to give her a turning point. She lives her life with the Bible verse as her daily affirmation. For I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord, thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you an expected end. Jeremiah 29:11. So let's all give a virtual round of applause to our panelists, and let's get into this very important topic today. I read a quote somewhere, and it says that education is the vaccine for violence. And I also saw another interesting quote, and it says, it's not about the domestic, violence is violence. So with that being said, I would like to ask our panelists, what roles have social media and technology played in relation to domestic violence? I mean, this is an age-old problem, but it's continuing. And with us having so many ways to connect to one another, I think it's important for us to bring in this technological aspect. So I'm going to ask the question one more time. What roles have social media and technology played in relation to domestic violence?
I can go ahead and start off. I have a lot of, because I think of 2 different issues there in terms of with media itself and the way that domestic violence is portrayed, and also issues surrounding technology, because I primarily work with, traditionally college age students who I am constantly trying to keep up with advancements in technology. And it seems like it, in a lot of ways, technology with different apps on phones and ways of tracking people has made our world a lot smaller. And so in a lot of aspects, it's made perpetrators have increasingly easier access to their victims, whether that's through, again, like tracking them, turning locations on and off of phones, again, different apps that I am constantly being made aware of that make it a lot easier for different types of power and different dynamics of abuse to take place. And then it also can be helpful for victims to be able to connect with other resources through the use of technology. So it doesn't necessarily always have to be a bad thing. In terms of media, I just think of a lot of the ways that media often portrays domestic violence and dating violence as being very normalized. I think of like a lot of movies like Twilight, or there's that Netflix show called You that really normalizes different aspects of stalking that seem to be really big hits. But then when you take a closer look, it's like, no, these are severe aspects of control and dynamics of abuse that maybe we're minimizing, or that society has been able to normalize because it is portrayed as something that's really glamorized. So those are some of the ways that I've just seen it from some of my clients that have brought some of those issues up, or things that I've worked with them on.
Absolutely. I have to agree with Jessica. I think that there's so much technology as far as the tracking. I think that that's the part maybe that's actually a discouragement and can easily, detect and put someone in contact with their victim. In addition to that, I also think that the media, Dr. Snyder, I think it downplays it because domestic violence is really huge. And I think they just pretty much downplay it. They don't, look at the rules, look at the laws, and really enforce them enough and show actually the severity of domestic violence and how it's actually grown. So I think they actually downplay it, and it's not really enough attention on it to show how serious it is. Technology definitely can improve in terms of how to connect the victim with, ways in which they can know when perhaps their abuser is released from jail. There used to be something years ago to let the victim actually know that, and they would actually link and let them know. I think it was called Vine Link. And they would actually let them know when their abuser was actually about to be released. And I don't see enough of that in technology.
Yeah, I agree with what everybody's saying. It's the way technology, intersects with domestic violence is similar to how technology intersects with all of our lives. There's both advantages and also downsides. It's really complicated. It has provided some benefit, but it also can provide just make things more difficult. So as was introduced, most of my work has been international. So that's just what I can speak to the most. And I will say, in what I've seen, it has really helped agencies connect with survivors in a way that they may not have been able to before. I work with an organization in the Philippines, and they're mostly focused on survivors of human trafficking, but their clients also experience a lot of domestic violence, even though they're not in their trafficking situations anymore and they're home in their communities. They're still experiencing a lot of difficulties in their families and in their intimate relationships. But interestingly, in the Philippines, Facebook is free. Like, it's free to get onto Facebook. If you can get a device, you can borrow a device with somebody. And so Facebook is how they communicate, how the agency communicates with their clients. And if they're in a crisis, like, they can get on Facebook Messenger and they can contact them. So it is a really critical point of communication with between agencies and women who are looking for support. So, but what everybody else has said too, like, it's another way of control. It's another way of stalking. It's another way, a form of abuse. So it's not one thing or the other. It's both.
Yeah, you all raised some interesting points about media and the normalization of violence. We know that we are all inundated with so many violent images, whether they be intimate partner violence, gunshots, on any given day. And with that normalization, right, comes this idea that we see intimate partner violence as being maybe one way, or whatever way it's promoted in the media. We don't get the picture that all people are impacted by intimate partner violence, no matter what socioeconomic background they come from, education, color, gender. So with that being said, I would like for you to clarify for the audience, what are some aspects or dynamics of an abusive relationship? Can you all speak to that and tell our audience what are those things? Because we're not seeing that play out in the media, but probably in certain specific ways.
If I may, Dr. Snyder, I would actually say I know we know, or maybe in terms of thinking the warning signs, like physical abuse, sexual abuse, economic abuse, mental and verbal, which we know definitely tie in together. But in addition to that, you have fear, you have them families, the victim actually not knowing stability as far as having a place to live. In addition to that, maybe childcare, job security when they have a job, if they're able to maintain that job, because if their abuser perhaps knows where they're working, they could cause problems on their job, and then they actually lose that job, which leads to no income or less income, where they're not able to maintain a household, which unfortunately sometimes sends them back into the same relationship where they just left from, so that they can have some stability. But certainly those are some of the dynamics of it.
Yeah.
I think all of those absolutely, like Ella mentioned, and I'm glad you mentioned some of the emotional impact of the victim, like that fear that's instilled in that often keeps them staying. And one way that I often frame it to my clients is that abuse is anything that takes away your agency or your ability to fully live out your life the way that you want. Your independence, what makes you you, what makes you feel alive. When those things slowly and very strategically start being stripped away, that's what I consider abuse. And I think we've seen more and more, especially with the pandemic. And I know this could be a separate conversation and a separate topic altogether, but with that, we've seen a lot of isolation. That's something that has just been further compounded, especially like in the early days of COVID, when we were all figuring things out and in kind of lockdown or quarantine, the ways that isolation, if people are already isolated from their friends, just furthers that and further keeps people from being able to access resources that they need in order to leave maybe abusive relationships. And I think a lot of times it's framed from the abuser as, well, this is me taking care of you, or this is me because I love you so much. I don't want you to have to rely on other people or other things. And it's just a form of control. We hear a lot about the term like gaslighting. I think a lot of us are familiar with that, but just from like my client's perspective, it makes them feel like they're going crazy. What's wrong with me? There must be something wrong with me. Instead of putting the full responsibility where it belongs. And again, I think all of these things are just perpetuate and keep our victims stuck in very violent, very dangerous situations that unfortunately only get worse as we know over time.
Did
And
anyone else want to add to that?
I just want to add one thing that I totally agree with everybody. And one other unique aspect is a common tendency of trying to belittle and reduce the self-esteem of persons in that abusive relationship, so that the person will just somehow start this kind of self-blame, and I'm not really worthy, and I somehow, what's going on is my fault if I had only done things differently. That's also a common aspect. And also just to say that from the research perspective, when I really started researching domestic violence, I was really struck by the fact that those like emotional and psychological forms of abuse are the kind that have the most long-lasting impact.
Okay. Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that point up, because it kind of leads directly into my next question. And we don't even do like domestic violence work per se at Alabama Appleseed, but we have uncovered how something as simple as a woman not having her driver's license impacts her ability to work or to get freedom. And so, like you've mentioned, many of the panelists in the previous question, that the pandemic has shut down some ways or avenues for women to, or people who are not just women, folks that are experiencing domestic violence can be further impacted by it. Can you all talk a little bit more about how the pandemic in some specific ways has led to an increase of domestic violence calls throughout our country, and especially in our state of Alabama.
Right. I think I was going to say pretty much what Jessica said in terms of isolation with the pandemic, because pretty much it's like you're closed in now, like you're locked down. Now you're in that common space together, and job losses played a major factor. So if you're in that household and now it's job losses, now it's affected the whole dynamic of domestic violence, where it increases. I think I've read somewhere where in the United States, there was an 8.1% increase during the pandemic. And someone actually referred to the increase of domestic violence being a pandemic in a pandemic, which is pretty huge. And in addition to that, I just think globally, countries were affected. I read somewhere where it's 50 to 60% in two countries where it actually increased. So isolation, being alone together, I think enhanced a lot of domestic violence increase.
Do you want to expound upon, I feel like you can, upon isolation in a
Absolutely.
bigger way? I mean, isolation does put you in closer proximity, right, to your abuser, but can you speak a little bit more about how isolation works in terms of making it difficult for a person to fight back, or signs or tools that we can equip some of our listeners with to recognize as, hey, this person is trying to isolate me for the intention of hurting or harming me? Can you speak a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. I'm so glad you asked me that, Dr. Snyder, simply because during the time when I was actually a victim of it, you have to realize that warning signs sometimes can be not as obvious. And so when it comes to being isolated, it can go in terms of something very cunning, in the effect of, I just pretty much want us to spend time together. I want us to just have this time together. And after a while, you just begin to do that. You think it's something really sweet. You don't recognize it being a form of abuse, and that is you're being isolated. And what happens is the friends that would normally call you and perhaps say, hey, let's go out, let's go hang out together, let's go to dinner. Now they see your nose are constant. And so now you're put in that place of isolation. And when you're isolated, you feel like it's just you and that person, that abuser, if that's the case. But in my case, thank God I had, good supporters. But at the same time, with isolation, in terms of not being aware that that's exactly what's going on, you can find yourself being isolated. And in the midst of that, losing your identity, which I think is a bigger form of isolation, because now you're isolated and then you don't know who you are.
Wow. Did anyone else want to add to that? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I just want to say also, there's such a stigma and shame that even if you don't want to be isolated, you want to reach out and tell somebody what's going on, you can feel so embarrassed and ashamed. And even if it's not really your fault, it's just such a stigmatized topic that you really may not tell, people may not really know. You may feel really ashamed to tell people what's going on.
Yeah, I can definitely echo that. I have talked to so many clients that initially will come into my office and say, I don't feel like I deserve to be here because it's not as bad as somebody else. So they feel like, well, I'm taking up somebody else's time, and I don't need to be here. I don't deserve to be here, because they start comparing their trauma to someone else. And you have to really work with, no, you absolutely deserve to be here. And I'm glad that you're here, and meeting them where they are, of course, like we do as social workers. But just to echo the larger issue with the pandemic and that isolation factor, I think a lot of us, just from the perspective of an agency kind of situated on a larger university, I can remember when the pandemic first happened and we were shut down for a while, and kind of scrambling to figure out how are we going to still be able to meet clients' needs and be able to see people that need to be seen. And so before we had the technology that we have to be able to see clients over Zoom, it took us several months to get to that point. So a lot of clients that are used to having regular therapy sessions during that initial kind of shutdown and quarantine period didn't have that. They still had access to our, crisis line, of course, but while we were kind of still figuring things out, I think that might have been just one component that made things more difficult for our survivors. And then once we got everything squared away with getting our HIPAA compliant Zoom, getting that up, figuring out kind of just logistics with all of that, I think that was actually helpful and increased access to maybe some survivors that now they're able to see their therapist from their home if they're in a private location. If they're not able to come into the office, now they can see us virtually. So that has ended up being a positive. Again, kind of going back to kind of some issues and some positives with technology. But I just think about, I think a lot of our clients are still reeling from trying to regain some sense of normalcy with everything that the pandemic has caused.
Yeah, so my next question is kind of twofold because you all have brought up so many interesting points. I wanted to go back to the point of normalization that you mentioned earlier. It's been normalized in the media. I even know from a Black perspective that, coming from a community where people are often oppressed and marginalized, we don't like to talk about domestic violence because it's another strike, right, against the community. But we're hearing over and over again just how rampant this problem is. How do we change? The first part of the question is, how do we change, or what do you all suggest we do to make it not be such a stigmatized type of topic? I know Tina Turner has been, or certain people have been, vocal about it. And the second part to that is, how do we do that? But also we have to provide help for those who are the abusers. And so I would like for you to speak to, what can we do to help people who have these tendencies to act violently towards others? Because I think that's also a part of it. We're leaving out the people who are responsible from the conversation. Is usually victim centered. So I know it's kind of loaded, but I would love to hear you all's thoughts on that. You need me to recap? Or are you thinking through? So it's how do we get it to, how do we make the conversation not so like today's, we're talking about it, but what are some ways to really make this not something where people don't feel as ashamed about it, where we can say, hey, I need help for this. And I think that includes us talking to people who are the victimizers. So how do we get help for them, or what can we do to help people who feel like they have a family member who exhibits violent tendencies in that way?
Wow. Yeah, that is loaded, but definitely warrants some a huge response.
Yeah.
So I would actually say, because in reading my bio where you saw, the information about educating and speaking to Northport Police Department and Tuscaloosa Police Departments,
Mm-hmm.
I think education awareness is huge. And when you mentioned earlier, Dr. Snyder, about especially in the Black community, yeah, because it seems like it's something embarrassing or you don't talk about, as Dr. Carson mentioned, also something you don't mention or you don't talk about, but it's definitely necessary.
Mm-hmm.
Something that I didn't see a lot of was a lot of workshops pertaining to it. So I think there needs to be, a lot of workshops. I think in addition to that, there needs to be in the churches, if you will, because we do know some pastors don't allow that in the church. However, we need more of that in our community, so that education awareness is out there, so that people know. And I'm looking at this month by itself. We know that October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And definitely not saying anything at all about breast cancer, because we know that's huge too. But domestic violence gets put on this level, and is not really, it doesn't seem to be as important. So
Right.
I think, as in terms of that educating more, maybe doing more, like I said, workshops, perhaps meetings, sharing like information, resources. And in addition to the abusers, there are therapists who will help the abusers, if you will, Dr. Snyder, but they have to be willing to, so that they can identify first that they are abusers, and then why they're abused, and then definitely what type of abusers they are. So those things are very important, but there are therapists. In my research, I didn't see a whole lot, but I do know that there are therapists who are willing to speak with the abusers to help them to understand why they do it, and in terms of trying to help them the next steps so they won't do it, continue to do it. And then I think lastly, you asked about a friend, or how does someone who knows or suspects their family, is that what you said, who's being
Someone is
abused?
being an abuser.
Okay, so I would say tread lightly. Most of the time, and it's human nature, because some people actually say, I think I do know they're being abused, so I'm just going to tell them, just pack your bags and leave. Please don't do that. Please don't do that. They actually need a plan. As with anything, you need to develop a plan. And so you would in terms give them the resources. Like I mentioned in my bio, I had Turning Point to help me. I didn't mind going to the shelter, whereas some people do. But you know, you have to have those resources available. During that time, I received counseling. I received much more information that I needed. For a friend to know that it's okay, reach out to someone, to an agency, tell them, hey, I think I've got a friend who is in domestic violence. So what do I need to do? Are there any pamphlets, any brochures I can give? What can I suggest? But follow steps, you know, because you definitely don't want to tell them to do something drastic that may cost them their lives.
Yeah. Yeah. Dr. Carson, I mean, that was a great answer, first of all, but I would love to hear too from the international perspective, Dr. Carson. What do you think we can do to take some of the stigma away about domestic violence, and perhaps what types of resources are out there for people who are abusers?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. To be honest, I feel like other countries have done a better job than we've done in the US, at trying to address it from like a societal issue. So I worked on a program called SASA, which is a Swahili word that means now. And the idea is that now is the time to stop domestic violence. And SASA is an approach that was developed by colleagues in Uganda in Africa. I just worked on it as an evaluator, like I'm a researcher, so I helped them with the evaluation, but it's really their program that they developed that has been very, very successful and replicated in many countries around the world. I think now they're in like 40 different countries around the world. And it's a program that is what they call community mobilization, like a community organizing. So they train people, like respected leaders already in a community, whether it's like the pastor or just like a well-known prominent person, and they take them and they train them and they talk about the issue of domestic violence. And they really break it down to a very personal level by first talking about power. And the idea is that every single human on this earth in some ways has experienced what it's like to have someone have power over you. And we've also experienced what it's like to have power over another person. Maybe it's a child. We all have certain ways of power and privilege, whether it's based on our age, race, gender, ability. So having people like connect with that at a personal level of what it feels like to have someone who has power over you. And so it's just like really taking it down to those bases, and they have these community conversations. And then they take those people who are respected leaders and they go out and talk to other people in the community. And it's not just, okay, we have a group for survivors, we have a group for batterers. It's just, let's just talk about it in the community, everybody, not like wait till something happens and then get our group of batterers and try to change them. It's like very proactive and just trying to change the social norms about power that abusers have over their victims. And it's a very powerful program, and it's evidence-based. And there's also a version called SASA Faith that's specifically for working through churches and faith-based organizations. So I can put a link to it, and it's something that I've tried with people here in Alabama to bring actually to the US. And in Alabama, we haven't been successful with that yet, but it is unique. I do think that international context, we have something to learn from them.
Yeah, and you led right into the next question, so you can add to it if you would like, but I would love to hear from the other panelists. How can we improve domestic violence rates at the intersections of race, gender, and class? You've added the component of spirituality or the cultural aspect of people who go to church. You know, that's one way. Are there other ways we can help to improve domestic violence rates at certain intersections? Would anybody like to speak to that?
Can you repeat that?
Yeah, we how do we improve these domestic violence rates at the intersections of race, gender, and class? I was just mentioning that Dr. Carlson, speaking of a specific group of people, these are spiritual people. So the church was brought in because it's cultural. It's a way for them to hear, you know, and learn because they respect the church. Are there other ways for us to have these improvements at certain intersections? You know, how can we do that? Do you have ideas about that? I know it's not a, you know, we can't fix it all in a,
Right.
but
Right.
just generally speaking, what are some ideas or your thoughts about that?
Right, right. Absolutely, because we do know that abusers can be anyone, doctors,
Mm,
pastors,
mm,
teachers, people in, as Dr. Carlson mentioned, when she talked about power, people who are in those powerful authorities. We do know that those can be abusers. So I would say reach out to all of those entities, the law enforcement, definitely pastors in the communities. Go to different places that I would say this because you mentioned about African Americans. So with that, we do know Black and Latinx are among the most victims, right? So with that being said, you want to target areas that you mainly think maybe perhaps the families would be. So I would say actually not necessarily this, but homeless shelters, uh, maybe put them out in different, you know, areas of the communities. You have so many avenues that you can introduce this to. You have schools. You need to definitely do it in schools and start at a young age. Where
yes.
you're actually, you know, start at a young age where you're actually in the schools talking to them because they're not too young as far as witnessing domestic violence and not per se understanding what it is. So starting right there in the schools and then going up through the schools education wise to let them know and different ways in the communities, any area, the communities to get the word out about what it actually is and not to downplay it that, oh, they just pushed me. Oh, they just slapped me, to get the information about the warning signs. So I think just education is key.
I have to speak to that point. I'm so glad you just raised that because I wanted to ask you all about the spectrum of violence. I know growing up in the community I grew up in, I saw domestic violence, you know, happen close up and far away. And I would often hear the victim say things like, but it's not like this, you know, it's not like the Lifetime movie, but there's a spectrum of violence. And you just started the conversation off with letting us know it doesn't have to be your life on the line for you to be experiencing domestic violence. So can any of you speak to that spectrum where it starts at, especially for youth? We're seeing those numbers increase for young people in high school. And I taught at many colleges. I've had many students to tell me that they were being abused. I mean, really, I've seen students with bruises and all kinds of things. So can you all speak to the spectrum of violence that occurs in intimate partner violence, that it doesn't have to be you running for your life? Would you like to start this off, Jessica?
Sure, I would love to. Because I think it all starts as a form of disrespect, right? When I first mentioned, like anything that is stripping you from your ability to make decisions, your ability to feel in control and empowered in your life. And so often it doesn't start as, you know, physical forms of violence, but can quickly escalate. But just being disrespectful in it, maybe a dating relationship, or even a friendship that can start off saying disrespectful things, doing things that knowingly would make the person feel bad about themselves, degrading them, making disparaging or remarks that again are
Mhm.
degrading or just erode their self-esteem, how they feel about themselves. So then it's easier once I start to feel bad about who I am.
Mm.
It's easier for that other person to start kind of escalation of control and violence, and then can continue to things like making threats or even the prospect of threats. I've worked with clients where it has escalated to where maybe they lay a weapon for them to see as a form of like, I can, like, here it is, I'm showing you that this is what I could do, even if they don't ever intend to use that. It's still a way of controlling them and exerting that power just by displaying a weapon. And then might kind of throw it around or point it at them before ever using it. And again, it just speaks to that fear, right? Why would I ever reach out for help or reach out when you're so isolated and so in that fear where you're not able to speak for yourself, you're not able to use your voice as you normally would. So it can escalate, it can look very different in lots of different ways. But those are just some things that kind of stand out to me right now.
Mhm.
What I've seen.
Would anybody else like to add to that?
I would, unless, were you going, Dr. Carson?
No, go ahead.
Okay. I think in terms of going back to the age, I think starting when they're little in their youth, starting young,
Mhm.
because definitely knowing your identity is important. You
Mhm.
can definitely lose your identity in someone else if you don't know yours. And so it's important to start there at that young age to introduce them to these things. Definitely, because in relationships, and we've all had, relationships, some people think jealousy is cute, but jealousy is also deadly.
Mhm.
And so in relationships, you want to be very cautious, because when you actually start off and going back to isolating or something like that, or where the abuser is able to pick up on perhaps your self-esteem is low, they target those things, as Jessica mentioned. And not only that, if not everybody, going back to this, not everybody who were victims are, fall into the category of being poor, uneducated. As you mentioned before, it could be anyone. It could be anyone. And so it's super important to start there at their young age to let them know their identity and their strengths. And because someone, it could actually come in easily at a young age. And when I've been speaking at schools from elementary to middle school to high school, even college, because there was one young lady, just to give an example, she was actually being abused. She was probably a size 4, and she had to weigh in every week for her abuser. And if she gained a pound, she had to lose it. And she actually thought this was okay. So I think things like that are super important for you to let the person know, starting with their youth, the importance of who they are and their identity, so that the strength, even with that, not saying it solves everything, not saying it will keep it from happening, but at least if you try to instill and start at those ages.
Right. Well, you know what, because we don't know who is on this call, and according to these stats, there are people on here right now who could have been experiencing this. So we have a couple of minutes left before we open up the floor for questions, but I would like to hear from each one of you. What are some typical things that you've seen survivors do that makes them thrive? Because or traits that you recognize. If there's a person on here who is experiencing abuse, you would say to them, hey, in order for you to really conquer this and to overcome this, these are typically things I've seen people do to overcome domestic violence. If you all can share traits or tools or tips, in case there is someone on the line who just needs to know what they can do in order to, like I said, to thrive if they are facing a situation like this.
I think one of the biggest ways I've seen is having that resilience and being able to move through an abusive relationship is making sure you have a support team, a support system, whether that's your healthy friends that you have in your life, even one person that they can tell. I always tell clients as soon as they enter my office that there's a tremendous amount of barriers that they've had to even face, and even to just get to that point of where they are, to say like, hey, acknowledging that's an issue takes a tremendous amount of strength and courage in being able to reach out for help. So whether that's going to therapy, finding a support, there's lots of support groups out there where survivors can speak to other survivors, which is tremendously helpful from what I've seen in the groups that I've led. So just having that that sense of community, again, to combat a lot of that isolation that we see that those abusers are perpetrating.
Anybody else want to say anything? Add to that?
Definitely. I think to make sure a person knows you are not alone. You are not alone. There are people who are going through this, have gone through this, and there are so many ways to let you know this is not how it has to end. This is not the end of the story. As a survivor, that, you know, I can reach and do anything. Supporting, having support system, having resources. I mean, good resources. Not being embarrassed. How do you not be embarrassed? Being comfortable enough. That's huge. You have to be comfortable enough to trust a person to tell them what you're going through, because so many people are judgmental, and, you know, in different ways for different reasons. Some mean well, they really do. But in actuality, you have to be very mindful. This person is going through something traumatic. And so with that being said, you know, that you can overcome it and show them the tools, not just tell them, but give them the tools about their self-esteem, their self-worth, their self-value, instilling those things. You are this person. Yes, you can do this, and give them those things that they need, and speak it with authority to them that you are, and you are not. I cannot emphasize how you have to say you are not alone, because sometimes people feel like I'm in this place all by myself and no one understands, but you will ultimately be surprised at people who can relate to you.
Wow. And Dr. Carson, you add, please, something you'd like to share before we turn the floor over back to Mrs. Wilkes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was very, very well said about in terms of a message to survivors or people going through this right now. I think I would have a message more for people who want to support others. And that is, this is just basic like social work principles, but to listen and to not assume, like we talked about the intersections. We all have different aspects of our life that create different life experiences for us. So we can't assume that what I've been through, even if I've been a survivor myself, that my experience is the same as yours in any way. So we really have to listen to survivors. We have to be there for them. We have to be patient, and to, as much as we want to not give advice, you know, to be like, just ask, how can I help you? And to also understand that it is a process that people have to go through. It's not a one-time deal for somebody to get out of an abusive relationship. And that can be really hard to sit and watch, really, really hard. But that just to be patient and loving and continuing to be supportive and listen to what they need, and to understand that they're going to live their own life, they're going to make their decisions, and you're just there to be supportive of that.
Wow. I'm so glad you talked about it being a process, like everything is. And oftentimes when we're overcoming something, we want it to just end, but it is a process. So I really appreciate you all sharing. I think I'm turning the floor back over to Mrs. Wilkes. And this was just a rich conversation. I wish we could keep going. I have lots of questions floating around my head, but I know we only have an hour. So thank you to our panelists. You all have been very, very transparent and very informative. We appreciate you.
Thank you, Dr. Snyder, Dr. Carson, Ms. Jessica, and Ms. Ella. This has been a very rich conversation, a very much needed conversation. And I know we can go on and on. I have one question before I turn it over to Peggy Swells, who will talk about our CE contacts. So we have a lot of social work students in the space with us. What are some of if someone is interested in going into domestic violence IPV work, what is something that you will say to them, for encouragement or advice as they enter into that profession?
Pace yourself. It is hard work and it's very rewarding, but I've also had to learn the art of course, self-care we talk about a lot, because there is a tremendously high rate of burning out in any form of social work, but especially when you are when you're working face to face with survivors of horrendous forms of violence all day, every day. Make sure that you have a plan for yourself to take care of you, to make sure that you're able to be there for the people that you need.
And just piggybacking on that, I totally agree. And so another message that I would want to tell students is that there are different ways of working on this issue. We need the frontline workers who are providing case management and services and support and working in shelters. But that is, as Jessica said, very taxing and you can burn out. And as a person who experienced that, there's other things, I do research now, and you can do advocacy, you can do policy work, you can do more of the community mobilization and prevention work. So there's different ways that you can get involved. And even if it's not your job, there's ways you can volunteer and just be an advocate. So I would encourage everyone to keep that in mind.
Ella?
Mhm.
Okay. I would actually say, just remember one day at a time. It's one day at a time. It's, if you're going to go into it, just make sure, I would say be open. Just be very open to hear any and everything that you may hear. And then always have the resources, and always remember, if you don't have them, refer them to someone else who might. Because that's super important, because sometimes, we feel like we have to have all the answers. No, we don't. So I think in terms of that, we need to be able to share other resources. So just know that there are other people around you to help support you too in that field.
Thank you so much. I will turn it over to Miss Peggy, who will talk about our CE contacts.
Thanks, Sharon. So again, thanks everybody on the panel, and thanks for all who joined us today. Today's Noontime Knowledge series does qualify for one contact hour. So one CEU, you will be emailed that either this afternoon or tomorrow. So please look for that. And if you don't receive that, feel free to contact me. Also want to invite you all to next month's Noontime Knowledge, which will be held on November 10th. And the topic is juvenile justice. So watch for that information as well as we continue this series with support of our administration. So thanks again. I'll get back to Sharon.
Thank you, Peggy. And there are also some resources in the chat. Made on Netflix is an amazing show. That's from Amanda. And so we have several chats. And thank you all for sharing in the chat. And there is one on this really great story about domestic violence and a woman who became a police officer as a result of the police officers not, really responding. And so that link from New York Times is in the chat as well. So the great chat, great conversation. One post that I think is very important to note that at an early age, some friendships begin in an unhealthy way. Toxic relationships, mean girls, those friends who want you to be only friends or are takers and never givers. And so I really feel that it is very, very important that we start at a young age to educate, our young adults as well about domestic violence and those implications. And so are there any final questions? We have about 3 minutes. if you all have any final questions, any parting thoughts, anything that you would like to share as we in our session today.
Sharon, I would like to just quickly add, because my mind is always on diversity, equity, and inclusion, is that, domestic or intimate partner violence can be same gender. It does not always have to have the dynamic of male, female, or vice versa. And I think that's important for us to acknowledge that this impacts all communities. And so I really just wanted to make sure that I gave that acknowledgement to our fellow people in the LGBTQ plus community. This is a problem across spaces.
Yes, I agree. Amanda said transgender was at the highest of IPV.
Mm-hmm.
So very good. All right. If any other questions, we have no other questions. Thank you again for your time. And this has been a very rich conversation. I know Sarah said in the chat, we can go on, and it is a very important topic. And so let's continue to raise domestic violence awareness, and not just during the month of October, but just continue to raise it and be a champion for those who, who are victims, and then also to help those who are abusers, because sometimes they don't know, and we are destroyed because of the lack of knowledge. And so when we're education is so important. All right. Well, without further ado, thank you again for your time. This would not have been possible without your support, attendees, and also Dr. Idrissa Snyder, Dr. Carson, Ms. Jessica Harga, and Ms. Ella Stewart. Thank you all so much. And a shout out to Lindsay Johnson and Peggy Swells for always being there to support the internal noontime knowledge. And so thank you again. And we look forward to seeing you November 10th for Juvenile Justice in America. Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.